All right, guys, welcome. It's another Hot Topic Tuesday. It is Tuesday, the 29th, 2023 of August. So guys, for what we call summer, it's almost over. And with us today after last week, great timing. We have Miss Karol Grove. I love that she has initials. Karol, you'll have to tell us what those stand for. We have initials in real estate also. But Karol is going to talk with us about flood zones. And I also know that Karol is also one of the premier speakers and experts regarding flood zones. So Karol Grove, I turn it right over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So good morning. I guess it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a little bit about myself. About almost going on 20 years now, I started seeing the need for education here in Michigan. And my initials after my name, to answer your question, was I'm a professional land surveyor. So I have my own business, was one of the first women ever to get licensed in the state of Michigan. And I have, currently we have an all-female land surveying company, which is really unusual. And we cover the entire state of Michigan when it comes to the topic of FEMA and flood zones. Probably about 10, 15 years ago, FEMA asked me to start teaching FEMA about flood zones, which was really a little bit unique. And many of the FEMA people that would listen to my class had these letters CFM, which is a certified floodplain manager, after their name. So I felt the need to go take this federal class or this federal test, which I took, and I became a certified floodplain manager. That way the FEMA people would maybe listen more a little bit, give me a little more validation to what I had to say about FEMA. So I've become a national expert on FEMA flood zones. I've spoken all over the country. They fly me to Alaska, to Vermont, all over the place, all these cool places. And I teach everybody about flood zones. And it just so happens you guys have me in your backyard here. So Michigan has a lot of flood zones, as you know. We have a lot of water, whether it's the Great Lakes, Lake St. Clair, or all of our streams, rivers, creeks, drains. There's just a lot of flood zones. So that's what we're going to talk about. I usually teach a 2-hour class to realtors. If we were all in the same room, I would probably ask how many people have actually seen me speak before. Usually it's a fair amount of them, but I can't tell by looking at my screen because I only have a few people up. So with that being said, at some point, if you guys like what I have to say this morning, hopefully you'll invite me back and we can do a 2-hour legal approved class. And it'll teach you, again, we're just going to give you a little taste about flood zones this morning, just so you are a little bit more on track with helping your clients. Okay. So let me see if I can get this advancement to work here. There we go. So again, as I said, about maybe 10, 15, 20, almost 20 years ago, I started learning just enough to be dangerous about all these other professions around us. What an insurance agent's role is, what a lender's role is, what a realtor's role is, what a homeowner and how they're affected by flood zones. And when you start learning about all these other professions and how we all fit together, you really can't understand FEMA and flood zones without knowing and crossing over into the other professions a bit and understanding everybody's roles. And so that's kind of what I teach you in this class, about how to help a property owner, a seller or a buyer, navigate the flood zone issues. Okay. And again, this will go really fast because 30 minutes is really quick. So I'm gonna try and cover a lot in just a very short period of time. But whether you're representing a seller or a buyer, you never ever want that word flood zone to come up. You always want the experience to be as pleasant as possible. And so what we try to teach in this class is to be proactive. If that word flood zone comes up, very often you're going to have a buyer running for the door. And by then you've already put a lot of work and energy into this, and you do not want to lose the sale. So again, it can be rather frightening. You don't want your buyer having a visual of all their worldly goods floating away. And so what we always teach you to do in this class is we teach you to be proactive. If you're representing a seller, for instance, you want to try and eliminate that problem before you actually get a buyer. Many times realtors will call me, it'll be just days before closing. They were not proactive and they're in a panic and they're saying, you know, what can you do to help me save my deal? And we want to cut it off. We want to stop that before that happens. So we teach people who are representing sellers to be proactive in such a way that they look up their own properties. Don't count on a lender to tell you when a house or structure is in a flood zone. You want to look it up with your own eyes. You want to be able to see for yourself long before it becomes a problem. So if we have a few minutes at the very end, I will jump out of my PowerPoint and I'll show you really quick how to look your properties up. There's a cool website to go to. And again, you know, if you come to my class later, we'll cover this in much more detail at that point. But we do want to educate your sellers. Your sellers, if they're already paying flood insurance, many times you might ignore that and then suddenly it becomes a problem. If we get the house out of a flood zone before they close, your seller should be entitled to almost an entire year refunded back to them. But if we wait until the last minute, many times the sellers will lose that refund because we don't have a lender anymore that's going to cooperate. Once that mortgage gets sold off or paid off, there's no longer a loan number to process a refund. Okay, so we do not, that's just an example of why we do not want to wait until the last minute to get somebody out of a flood zone, especially if your seller's paying. The other thing to note, if you're representing a buyer, our seller's disclosure here in Michigan, it doesn't ask the right questions. It only asks one question. It says, are you currently paying flood insurance? And that's not enough of a question. What you really want to ask is more questions. You want to say, have you ever been in a flood zone? Are you in a flood zone? Has the house ever flooded? These are all really good questions. Have you ever paid flood insurance? A seller can pay their mortgage off before they put their house on the market, and they can answer that question as, no, I'm not paying flood insurance. And so you might not catch it for your buyer. So again, you want to look it up, if at all possible, look these properties up, maybe before you represent the seller, before you list the house, look it up before you go to look at the house for the very first time. The best time to tell your buyer that we might have a flood zone issue would be at that moment when they fall in love with the house and say, this is the house I want. Then you would say, okay, we may have a flood zone issue with this one. We may want to write this right into the offer as a contingency. Okay. And flood insurance very often will price your buyer out of a house. So you do not want your buyer spending all this money on inspections, on appraisals, and then not catching it until the 11th hour. Most people would ask me, how much does it cost for me, a surveyor, to come out and check a house? It only costs usually $200 for me to check a structure and tell you, yes, I'm 100% sure I can get this one out or not. So at that point, you would probably move forward with the inspections and the appraisal. And when it comes time to actually pull the trigger, that might be when you would say, okay, get this one out. We're about to buy it. Okay.
So Carol, if I could jump in real quick.
Sure.
A couple of questions with that. So if I'm hearing you correctly, when we have a potential home in a floodplain, or it's actually in a floodplain, something that we could take as an action would be to call you out, have you take a look and see whether or not you might be able to get it passed without having or being in a floodplain. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, actually, in fact, and I'm kind of skipping a lot, but let me just cover that in a little more detail, because you're right. I'm trying to cover too much, and I jump around maybe sometimes and lose you. If the one thing to understand is when we look at a flood zone map and we see blue, everyone thinks that house is in a flood zone, period. If the blue is anywhere near a house, the lenders can force flood insurance. It doesn't even have to be touching. So the main thing to understand, if you don't learn anything else today in this class, remember that when we look at a flood zone map and you see blue, we still have absolutely no idea where the flood zone is. And the reason is because what really dictates whether a structure is in a flood zone is not these maps, although that's all we have to go by usually. It's really when a surveyor, somebody like me, shows up on the property and shoots the lowest point on the structure. Most people, many realtors thought, well, if it's in a flood zone, I don't want to even show this house. It's a lost cause, right? Well, that's absolutely wrong. In fact, when you see a map like this, and this is a typical flood zone map, you see blue, we think all those structures are in flood zones. We really don't know until a surveyor shows up and checks it. And then you know, yes or no, it's truly in a flood zone. So 85% of the time in Michigan, when we check a house, 85% of the time, I can get that house out of a flood zone. Okay. So
Wow.
that's a real important point to understand. Go ahead.
So that's a good $200 investment is what I'm hearing.
Pretty much. Again, 85% of the time, we're able to get structures out of a flood zone. And it's not unusual for me to have a realtor, a seasoned person in this class that will say, I never knew you could get a house out of a flood zone. I thought it was always in. If it shows up, it's in. And that's not correct. Of course, FEMA doesn't teach us about that part. They're more self-serving. They teach us how to force flood insurance on people, but they don't really teach us how to get people out of a flood zone. But that's basically what I'm teaching you today. FEMA teaches everybody how to serve the government. We're teaching you how to serve the people. Totally different twist, okay?
Yeah. So now a couple additional questions that'll come up out of this, but one, I'd like to give everybody an idea. I think you can help. So if a home does need to have flood insurance, how much might that increase the insurance by, just the flood insurance cost?
So usually it's an escrowed amount, okay, and they take it out. When you pay flood insurance, you always pay flood insurance a year in advance. So your client would have to come up with a lump sum. It used to be a lot more, but FEMA wrote some new laws just in the past year, and they brought the premiums down because private insurance companies came to Michigan and became very competitive. And so they were taking all of FEMA's money for flood insurance. So FEMA was forced to be more competitive with their insurance. So it used to be anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000. Now it can be anywhere between maybe $1,200 to $3,000. Okay. And that's per year. So your client would be forced to pay an initial $3,000, let's say. Let's just say 2,400 because that's easy math. And then every single month tacked onto their mortgage would be another $200 payment. And because it's going to be an escrow that the lender will save up. And at the end of that first year, the lender will mail off the 2,400 to the federal people or the insurance people. And that will pay for next year's insurance. So that's why we say it could literally price your buyers out of a home. Any other questions?
Your $200, it's asked a quick, what's involved in getting the house out of the flood zone, and does the 200 cover it, or is that just the initial visit?
200 is the initial visit. When we talk about flood insurance is on one building at a time. It's not on the property like a homeowner's insurance. So I have to say that if you have a house with a detached garage and maybe a shed or a barn, we will show up and we will check all 2, 3, 4 structures for the 200. And then we're going to tell you how many of those qualify to be removed. If we want to just get the main dwelling out and they're ready to close the deal and purchase, we would move forward with just the dwelling for $600 additional. So that would be $800 total. However, sometimes, and more recently than not, FEMA is now coming back and the lenders are forcing flood insurance on outbuildings, structures like barns and detached garages and even small sheds. So for each additional building, if your buyer wants to gamble and just get the main dwelling out, they can. It's not always going to be a sure thing that they come back and force flood insurance on outbuildings. But many times the buyer doesn't want this to come back and haunt them or even screw up their deal. So a lot of times they'll say, just get the other buildings out too. And so for each additional building you want out, we charge $100 because it's obviously more paperwork and more work. So let's say you have a main dwelling and a detached garage. If we're going to take the main dwelling and the detached garage out, it would be an additional $700 on top of the initial $200. Okay. Now, sometimes that $200 turns into $300 or $400 to check it, depending on travel time. Okay. But for most of you, I'm in the Detroit area. For most of you, most of the counties in the Detroit area, I think I'm counting 1, 2, 3. There's about 6 counties that we cover for the 200. Just to give you an idea, if you're as far away as Grand Rapids, we would charge an initial fee of $400 to check the structure. Okay. And then if you're up near the Traverse City area, I'd be charging $500 to check the structure. Okay. And then the UP, we love to go to the UP. If it's in the UP, we charge $800. Okay. So that kind of gives you an idea. Any other questions?
I think that's good for right now.
All right. So a lot of people ask, what is a flood zone? Many times, even surveyors, we get confused with the flood zone versus a wetland. Okay. And just to give you a little idea of the difference between a wetland and a flood zone, a wetland, and this is a very dumbed down basic definition of a wetland from many years ago when I was in college. Basically, sometime during the next 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 days, 10 months, there's going to be some standing water over there. Sometime within the next year, there's going to be some standing water. And again, it could be for 10 minutes or it could be 10 months. And that is very basic of a definition. Once a year, you're going to see some water standing in that area. And that would be a wetland. Now, what is a flood zone? Sometime in the next 100 years, you're going to see some water standing over there. That's a 100-year flood zone. And that's what we talk about today, the 100-year flood zone, or in any given year, there's a 1% chance of it flooding. So that is the bad one. It's called the 100-year or the 1%. And that's the one that lenders will force flood insurance on. Every one of us lives in a flood zone. Anywhere it rains, it can flood. But I'm up in a 500-year plus flood zone because I live up on a big hill. Some people live right down at the level of a lake or a river, and those are the ones that are obviously most affected by the 100-year flood zone. Once every 100 years, it might get some water in that area. Okay. And one other thing about the flood zone maps, when we look at them, when you go to school and you get an A, that's a good thing. When we look at flood zone maps and you see the letter A, that's a bad one. Okay, that means that's the 100-year flood zone if it has the letter A attached to it. Okay, and it can be A all by itself. A all by itself is actually the worst because I told you a couple times you might be able to wait right up to closing and then call us and we might be able to get you out of a flood zone in a matter of just a few days. However, if it's an A all by itself, and I'm telling you, places like Canton has a fair amount of A zones. Areas in the rural areas, if we get into like up near Owasso and out towards Lansing, when you get into some rural areas, you have a lot of these A zones, and those are non-studied zones. Well, the bad thing about that is it's going to take me every bit of 5 weeks to get that structure out of a flood zone. So you need to be more proactive when you see the letter A all by itself on those flood maps. There's this thing called floodway, which I'd like to cover in detail, but we're going to run out of time here. But I do want to point out what a floodway is because it's very important. It's an area where there's moving water in the event of a flood. Okay, what does that mean? That means it's a very high hazard area. There are a lot of floodway areas that are also, any floodway is also a floodplain, okay? But the floodway area is much more dangerous, and you're really not allowed to build in a floodway. However, before the very first flood maps came out, which were in the 70s and 80s here in Michigan, many structures were built in downtown areas on water. Downtown Rochester has them, downtown Birmingham, downtown Detroit, downtown Ann Arbor. every downtown area, when you think about it, most of them, all the old ones, were built on water, and many structures were built right up next to that water. And if they're built in what's called a floodway, then that's going to be moving water, which is a very high hazard area. We call it the highway for the moving water. Okay, so this is a typical flood map, as I said before. And if you look in the middle of this this blue, you'll see kind of a cross hatching, and that cross hatching is called floodway. So this building right here with the white roof, that actually is split by moving water. So many times I would ask people, do you think we could ever get this building out of a flood zone? And my surveyors in Alaska and my surveyors in Vermont all said, no way, that's in a floodway. You can't do anything. And they were 100% wrong. We had one just like this in downtown Lansing. They couldn't sell it for over 6 years. It was up on the side of a cliff. I went out on the side of that cliff. I checked that lowest point where the structure met the house, and it was 6 feet above the 100-year flood zone. So that meant this map was wrong. So again, remember, when you guys look at a map and you see blue, it doesn't mean it's 100% correct. It's usually wrong one way or another. And so we have to be cautious. And again, it can go both ways. If the blue comes anywhere near a structure, you should be careful, because that might mean that that structure is truly in a flood zone, okay, even though it's not touching the structure. Common sense has to come into play. When you print your sheets before you show properties, you should always look your properties up. I still have a few minutes. Can I go right to 12:30? You're muted. Yeah, okay. I'm going to go right to 12:30 if it's okay. I'm going to jump out of here and I'm going to show you how to look up properties, because I think that's really important. And again, hopefully you guys learned enough today, just enough to kind of wet your whistle, and maybe you'd like to come back and we talk a little bit longer on this and cover it in a little better detail and not so quickly, okay? So I'm going to skip over the last couple things. Letter of map amendment, I'm just going to tell you that is plan A. That's what we would do for a client if somebody's in a flood zone and we want to get them out of the requirement for flood insurance. If they qualify, we would remove the structure from a flood zone and they would no longer have to pay, and that would put them back possibly in a spot where they could qualify for their loan. So we don't physically lift the structure out, but we do it on paper, and then there's no longer a requirement. If I can't get a structure out of a flood zone, then plan B would be, can I put some flood vents in? Can I raise some mechanicals? And if so, I do that usually with an elevation certificate, and that would get your premiums maybe from thousands down to the hundreds. And now the house would be marketable again. So sometimes we can make a structure compliant when it's non-compliant, and you still save the deal, okay? The deal still does not fall apart because somebody really, really wants to pay flood insurance, or not pay flood insurance, but to actually get out. So I'm going to jump out. I'm going to reshare my screen in 1 second if I can do this the right way. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go to a Google search engine, and I'm going to share my.
And Carol, if you can multitask, there's a question I think you already addressed, but in the chat is, what about existing mortgages require flood insurance? If a house is removed, will the bank release the requirement for flood insurance?
Ask the question one more time. I'm so sorry.
So an existing mortgage that requires flood insurance, if it is removed, will the bank release the requirement for flood insurance?
Yes. So here's what a lot of times what we'll do. And so sometimes people will close the loans and they'll buy the house, and then they'll come looking for us and say, this flood insurance is getting too expensive. Help us. So we go in, we check it. We say, yep, good news. We can get you out. And so we would actually help you with the refund. And so we actually hold your hand through the process. We tell you, send this document to your lender. The lender will then give you a letter that says you no longer have to pay. And then you have to send both documents to your insurance agent and ask them to process you a refund. You usually get a full year back, okay? Between the escrowed and the prorated amount for the year, you usually get a whole year back, okay? Does that kind of answer the question?
I think that was pretty clear. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Your screen,
Right
by the
now-
way, it's hung up on the flood zone right now. Your PowerPoint going away.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because I was trying to push resume share and it wouldn't let me.
Well,
Hold
let me
on.
do something here on mine. Can I?
Let me get.
I'm just gonna say, I'll stop yours and then go ahead and try to kick back in again.
Okay, very good. All right, so I'm going to do share screen, and that's probably going to work now. Thank you. All right, so can
There
you
we
see
go.
my Google? Yeah, okay.
We see
Perfect.
Google.
Okay, so I'm going to show you guys how to look up the properties. Okay, you would go to my website, which is floodzoneexpert.com. It's right here, www.floodzoneexpert.com. And you see right away, this comes up, and you're going to click on the resources page. Either go straight to my website, or you can click on the actual resources page on my website. You know you're at the right spot because you'll see a bunch of blue. Because I'm on a Mac, it comes up a little weird. My site does. But again, we're on the resources page. And the very first choice under resources is how to check your structure. Okay. So the reason I'm taking you to my site is FEMA has too much money and they keep breaking their sites. Okay. And so if a site gets broken, everybody, the phone calls come into my office. So we instead would encourage you just go to our website. We probably catch it as soon as they break something and they start a new site up. We will hopefully upload the new site before you catch it. So if for some reason FEMA's site that you save to your laptop, desktop, iPads, if it doesn't work, go to my website first and see if we've got a new link there. So this is where you'll always find the new link. Click here to check a structure. We're going to click. This actually takes you to a FEMA site. We like this site better than some of the other sites you guys might be using, and I'm going to explain why in a second. But when this site loads, and it takes a minute because, again, they've been messing with their sites lately. When this site loads, a whole bunch of boxes come up. So we close out the boxes so we can see what we want to see here. And up in the upper right corner, you're going to see a layers button. We want you to click on the layers button, and we want you to go to the middle blue check mark. And just in front of the middle blue check mark is a little triangle. What I'm doing here is I clicked on that, a pull down menu came up, and I'm turning on every single LOMA in the whole country. Okay, what is that? That's everybody in the country who got out of a flood zone. Their documents are now going to come up on my screen when I open it. All right. So I'm not really sure what downtown area you'd like to see. I'll go to Birmingham just because that's a pretty centrally located one. And I'm going to show you real quick. Now, what you're going to do when you start to show houses again, right? When you print out all the people's sheets and everything, and before you get up from your computer, I want you to go to this website, save it to your computer, and then I want you to type in the address of every structure you're going to show that day. And you're going to zoom into the properties. This will actually zoom in for you. And what I'm doing right now is I'm just zooming into downtown Birmingham because Birmingham has a lot of water down there, and it's just one more that I can use it as an example. And again, I'm zooming in, and look at that cross hatching there. That's a red kind of candy cane. That is floodway. So we've got floodway shooting through downtown Birmingham. And again, we have helped quite a few people in this area. Let me see if I can get this to zoom in better. I'm trying here. Let me zoom up here. Zoom. There we go. Okay, so these purple numbers and letters right here, that's a LOMA. So we actually got this house right here out of a flood zone. So what you can do once let's say that you put your address in and it zooms in, and let's just say this is the house you're about to show, but there's a purple dot right over the top of the house. So I'm going to take my mouse and I'm going to left click on that purple dot. And these boxes will come up different ways depending on what type of computer you're on. Again, it's trying to call up the LOMA that was done on this property. So if there's purple dots anywhere near the houses that you're going to show, and if there's these blue lines, let's say scooting through the house, like see how these blue lines are clipping structures, that would be a bad thing. Okay. And you can literally zoom in and see it. Now, right now, I'm going to open up a box, and here's some blue lettering, and it says download letter here. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to actually show me the actual LOMA document that somebody had done on that house. Okay. And again, this was Baldwin Avenue, and it was downtown Birmingham, see, city of Birmingham. And it says that they actually were able to remove this house from the flood zone. It says removal at the top. So that's, again, I covered that really quickly, so I apologize, but that's about the only way I could do it, and do it fast, just to give you a taste of all the things you maybe don't know that you might want to know. Okay. And I think
Yeah,
we're
I
right
think
up against our time.
Yeah, you did really well. And if I'm right, you probably have everybody wanting more. So Karol will definitely be talking with you, and everything that anybody's told me, you were right on with it. So we'll talk with our group. We had a great showing today. I think I saw up to 40 people were on here, at least 40 logins, and so much more. So great presentation, fantastic presentation. There's been a few people that just sent those. I even had somebody send me a text just to let me know you did a great job. So guys, Karol has flashed her information up here. Hopefully you got that written down. If not, know that my Sherry here in Rochester is wonderful about getting the recording up and in your face, but I'll put it, she'll have it up there probably by 4 o'clock today for your review. And just know that, yeah, Karol told me that we're touching the tip of the iceberg. So if you can't wait and you see that she's out there doing some of these Con Ed sessions for you, and Karol, you said it's legal for 2 hours of legal, right?
Yep, we've got 2 hours of legal credits that you get. And CE Marketplace says this is the most taught class in Michigan. We teach it a couple times a week, depending on who asks us to show up. And I would prefer to teach it in person, just because of the interaction. And I just feel like I feel like we get a lot more one-on-one questions answered that way.
Well, wonderful. I'm going to see what we can do to be able to make that happen, and we'll run it from there. So guys, I'm going to say thank you again, Karol. Awesome presentation. That's going to bring up another wrap to Hot Topic Tuesday. I will let you know, reminder, we are not on next week. We will do a skip for next week due to the holiday. But on September 12th, it will be our Hot Topic Deep Dive. And with that, again, coming from you guys with suggestions, as Karol was today, we're going to be talking about stress and burnout. Something that's kind of important right now. So I've got a couple of agents that are going to be joining us to be able to discuss that. I'll be coming live from Troy on that session. So everybody in Rochester just got bumped. But anyway, we'll be live from Troy talking about how to be able to avoid stress and burnout in real estate. So again, got a holiday skip for the next Hot Topic, but we will be back together with you on September 12th. Karol, again, thank you so much. Everybody have a great one. Bye now.
Bye-bye.